I'm Chance Dorland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala has something special planned for this week's Thanksgiving Day episode, and I'll throw things to her now, along with her special guest.
Thank you, Chance. Today we have a special guest with us who is going to talk with me about juries, the people who listen to trial testimony and eventually deliberate to reach a verdict on guilt, innocence, and punishment. The public knows this about a jury of one's peers. You know, you go to jury duty, get to the courthouse by 8 o'clock in the morning, and wait all day to be picked among a huge throng of people. In fact, I did a story last year that their county calls about 1,400 people each week for consideration to serve on a jury panel. But it goes much further than that. Judge Joey Contreras, who sits on the bench in the 187th State District Court, is here with us today. And we're going to talk about juries, how they work and how they are picked, and what happens after they have done their service. I want to thank you, Judge Contreras, for agreeing to be on the podcast. Judge Contreras, you've been a part of jury selection for both federal and now state district courts, as both a prosecutor and a judge. Can you tell us a little about your experience on the federal side and which juries you have helped seat?
Well, I was assigned to do organized crime and large drug conspiracies, and I mainly focused on prison gangs. So I've done a lot of complex drug conspiracies that stretch from Mexico to all parts of the United States. But what I'm most remembered for is going after large gangs and bringing racketeering cases that involve hundreds of defendants and thousands of exhibits, and we're very complex. And one of the cases I tried, there were 24 murders alleged in the indictment. So I've gone after the big gangs, the Texas Mexican Mafia, the Texas Syndicate, and the Banditos Outlaw Motorcycle Gang, and picked juries in all those cases.
My gosh, that is quite a jury selection, it sounds to me. So, Judge, are there any differences in how a federal jury is chosen versus the juries that you have seen seated now as a judge over a state district court?
So the difference between the state and the federal system is night and day. In the federal system, the federal judges are not fond of jury selection, I would venture to say. And the lawyers have almost no role in it. The judge himself does all the talking and tries to weed out those who won't be fair, instructs them on the law and what they can expect. Whereas in state court, the lawyers play extensive roles. And depending on how lenient the judges are, jury selection can go on for hours and hours in state court, with the defense lawyer and the prosecutors addressing the panel for that long. So it's a very extensive role in state court.
What was that transition like, going from being a prosecutor on the federal side, choosing a jury, and then actually being the judge who watches other prosecutors do that in state district court?
It was a big transition. Look, I've tried probably over 300. I've probably picked over 300 juries, a whole bunch in state court and a whole bunch in federal court. And let me tell you this about jury selection. It's way overrated. You cannot ask your average person, are you a biased person, and expect them to say, yes, I am a biased person. They're just not going to tell you that usually unless they want to get out of jury selection, jury duty. I think what goes into so my point being that in the federal system, the big transition was that I played almost no role in jury selection, but it didn't bother me because I didn't think that jury selection had that much of an impactful role in state court, even though we got to talk to the jurors for hours and hours and hours, if that makes any sense.
Okay. Well, in my experiences in trials that I've covered, the judges have been very deferential to the jurors. I have heard some judges even say that they run the court during trial. What can you say about the roles jurors have during a trial?
Well, I would not go as far to say the juries run the court. The court runs the court. But one thing I try to impress on my juries. Number one, I'm very accommodating and indulgent of jurors. If they have any special needs, I try to make it as informal as possible and not make it seem like they're sitting in the principal's office for week-long trial. But one thing I always try to impress on jurors, and I always told them an example that I arrived upon, is that they were all there because they were summoned there. They had no choice. And I always compare them to a group of men and women who are 10,000 miles away, who are being shot at every day, and who are there not because they were summoned, but because they volunteered. And I think that would get their attention. And I would tell them that they are the bedrock of the democracy, our democratic system. And they are what stands between the government and the citizen. And I think it really impressed upon jurors how critical a role they played and made them take their role a little more seriously. So I always made jurors feel very, very important because I truly believe they are important. They really are what stands between a government that may be overreaching and a citizen who may be innocent.
Very interesting, very interesting. Judge Contreras, judges always direct and or admonish jurors that they cannot do things like do their own investigations, for instance. And I've seen them be told not to go to the scene or Google information about the case. Judges, rather, even tell jurors to not watch TV news or read newspapers or news websites about the particular offense or crime. Have you ever had an instance where you have had to admonish a juror for doing such things as these during proceedings?
I have not had a juror engage in improper conduct, and maybe I've been lucky, but I have also pointed out to them that the things have changed very quickly, and every one of them has access to a mini computer that can search, a million different websites in a matter of seconds, and that it is wholly improper for them to Google or do a search on any person, place, or thing relating to the case, because, as they say, not everything you read on the internet is accurate. And I said it's improper for them to start reading newspaper articles, watch TV, because in doing so, they're almost beginning to deliberate. That deprives both sides the right to have 12 people deliberate. That's the magic of the jury system. And to really get their attention, I have told them there have been many instances where jurors have misbehaved and not followed instructions, not with me personally, but that it gets exposed and they will be humiliated, they will be called to explain their actions, and they will jeopardize a trial that, a lot of resources have gone into. And that usually gets their attention. And just to be on the safe side, when they deliberate in my court, we take their phones away from them.
Oh, that's very interesting. I have actually in the past year seen judges in Bexar County call in a juror or two, not in your court, as you said, but I have seen them come in and they do get questioned, and it's interesting to see their reactions on their faces. And in those situations where it's occurred, they have actually been turned in to the judge by another juror because they began talking about something that they had been told they weren't supposed to. So that's a real interesting take on how you do that.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney.
Judge, I have noticed after the jurors have concluded their service, the judge, prosecutors, and defense attorneys will visit the panel in the deliberations room before they are released from their duties. Can you tell us a little bit about what goes on back there between the judge and the attorney?
Yes, let me preface it by telling you that this is, of course, a felony court. And in a courtroom, emotions are going to run high, one way or the other, with a defendant whose life is at stake or liberty is at stake, and with a jury that, they may be called on to decide whether a guy gets 5 years or life in prison. Because in Texas, we give so much deference to juries, we let them decide punishment. So they're basically sitting in judgment of someone's life. And I found it to be very emotional for jurors. It's very common. And Liz, I know you've seen this with jury panels coming in after they've reached a verdict, with some of them with tears in their eyes. It doesn't matter whether it's a guilty or not guilty. There's still tears because the decision they've reached is so monumental. So when the verdict has been rendered, there's always emotion on the faces of the jurors. I like to go back there in a form of reassurance to tell them, I knew you reached the right verdict before it was handed to me because it was your verdict. And they'll have real concerns and they want reassurance. You did fine. You did fine. You considered the evidence. You deliberated, and there's no such thing as a wrong verdict if it's a proper verdict. It reached some proper form. And they love to hear that. And they always ask, how would you have handled the case? And they just are dying to know that. Every one of them asks me what I would have done. And there's a strict rule that you are not to embarrass jurors, and I never do. But I tell them how I felt about the case, my take on it, without embarrassing them or anything. Because I think they almost always get it right. And then, of course, I will ask them. The lawyers often want to go and talk to the jurors because they're dying to know how they reached their verdict and why they did. So I ask the jurors first, do you all mind speaking to the jurors? And so they almost always are willing to. But the lawyers go, I think, if they won the case, to get a little bit of a pat on the head. And if they didn't lose, to find out what they could have done. I mean, if they didn't win, what they could have done differently. So it's an interesting dynamic. I personally, when I was a prosecutor, I stopped talking to jurors about 20 years ago. I didn't find it was all that helpful. I don't know why. I just never did.
It would be an interesting thing to see if jurors actually could ask their own questions during a trial, because I know that in several cases that I have seen through the past year, sometimes in looking at the jurors, you can tell they just want to raise their hand and they want to say something, or they're actually, boring holes through someone with their eyes because they're so riveted in the testimony they're hearing. So, gosh, that would be a really interesting thing to be able to go talk to a jury after they've decided a verdict or a sentence. Of course, as a reporter, I've tried many times to be able to get access to the jury, but judges have a tendency to seal those documents immediately afterwards. So that's not something that I've been able to do lately.
Well, you know what? It is interesting to listen to jurors, but they tend to get it right. Listen, if you can get 12 people off the street, basically, who are complete strangers, to reach a unanimous verdict, they're probably going to get it right, because it's hard to get 12 strangers to agree on what they're going to have for lunch. And if they all agree, it's probably a good lunch. You know what I mean? I think the system works beautifully. And so when you talk to them, they'll sometimes will come up with things that you didn't think of. Like, very interesting. I didn't catch that. But yeah, you're right. So you put 12 minds together, and they're going to do pretty good. I think I love our jury system. I think it works pretty good.
Well, Judge, are there any final thoughts about being a juror? Is there something that we haven't talked about today that maybe future panelists in Bexar County should know about their role as being a juror?
Oh, you know what? I just wish that, and I tell jurors this, I wish they didn't find it such a burden. I'd give anything to be able to serve a jury. I never will, of course. And probably you neither, Liz, because we've been in the system so long, they probably wouldn't trust us. But
probably not.
Probably, right? But I just think the system is beautiful. And I just wish jurors didn't look at it as a burden or some obligation they have to, like paying taxes, you know? And I try so hard to impress upon them what a critical, and I always tell them, right now, I'm going to ask you a question without thinking, answer. What does this country ask of you besides paying taxes? And there's silence. I said, there's one thing they ask, that you once or twice in your lifetime serve on a jury. It's not much to ask to start live in the best country in the world. And that kind of makes an impression.
That certainly would make an impression, I believe. Well, I want to thank you so much. We have just spoken with Judge Joey Contreras. He will be the presiding judge of the 187th State District Court through December 31st. As Bexar County Prosecutor Stephanie Boyd will be sworn in January 1st. Judge Contreras, I thank you so much for your time, and it's been a pleasure watching you serve as judge.
Oh, thank you, Liz. I appreciate it. You're welcome.
And big thanks to San Antonio Express News courts and crime reporter Elizabeth Zavala, as well as our special guest, Judge Joey Contreras, for joining us for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.